What's cooking, folks? Vermillion Phoenix here, and today we're here to talk about Deadeye and Orcs Must Die Unchained. Deadeye is a half-orc, half-elf who shows up wielding dual crossbows and has a surprising command of area of effect damage. She's one of the first characters that are being added to the game that actually tie into multiple other characters' backstory, and that characters like Midnight have interactions with her in her bio. And I think it's interesting just to see her actually in play now. She comes in right after a number of changes were added to some of the in-game and sabotage mechanics, with very little crowd control options and a heavy focus on just being able to deal damage to enemies very consistently and in a very powerful way. So I think we should talk about her primary abilities as they exist, and then as usual we'll get onto the weavers and things that I think work well for her as far as traits and traps. At this time she does not have a trap affinity bonus, and I'm not sure if that's something that plans on being reworked or that will make its appearance in the game anytime soon for the characters that are missing them, but it would be nice to see. Either way, let's start with the abilities. Deadeye's primary attack, Fill 'em with Holes, is a rhythmic 2-beat shot from her dual crossbows. It's a pretty solid attack overall in that it has a number of weavers that feed into it that can increase the damage and overall just make it a really solid tool to use against just about any type of enemy. Due to it firing 2 shots instead of a single one, it becomes a little bit easier to deal with soldiers, and because of the unique way that Deadeye is able to stack her different damaging abilities on top of each other, she has very little issue with the damage reduction ability that soldiers have in general. So that's a pretty good plus for her. She winds up doing about as much damage as Cygnus without the need to tether herself to a rift shard. So you'll find that when used properly, she does quite a bit of damage. But that's just from the primary attack. Let's move on to her secondary ability now. Deadeye's second ability, Bouncing Bomb, is exactly as it says. It fires a bouncing bomb that explodes on contact with enemies or after a few seconds. It has about a 1 tile radius, and when anything is hit, it will deal damage in that radius to everything in the area. Now, it is one of the stronger abilities that she has out of the gate. It doesn't have a huge amount of cooldown. It does a large chunk of damage, and it's pretty much her tool for dispatching medium to heavy enemies that are sort of rank and file in the game. This is what you would use against your trolls and ogres more often than not, and it may have some success against bosses, but really you're going to hope that you have ready steady fire on cooldown for those. That said, you want to use it whenever enemies are heavily grouped up, or whenever you have a situation that calls for a large amount of area damage. But in addition to that, her third ability actually helps out with that, and we're going to move into that next. Deadeye's third ability is Elven Razor Weed. It'll summon a 1 unit radius of weeds in a perpendicular line in front of Deadeye, and this will slow enemies that cross it as well as deal damage to them on contact. And it has about a 5-second uptime with a 10-second cooldown, so you're going to see a good amount of enemies pass through it. It's more beneficial if they can group them up, as always, and because of that, it is effectively an area damage ability. With the added slow, it has some minor elements of crowd control, but the most important thing that you're probably going to find from it is how many enemies you manage to damage. In some situations, as long as their health isn't buffed, you can actually just wipe out an entire pack of kobolds running out of a gate just by using the ability. So it has some very strong uses, and it is actually just really good all around, and that's even before you get into the weavers. That said, it's an ability that I think that players who use her will probably want to get accustomed to using and learn its tempo, but otherwise it's just good. From there, we're going to move on to one of her most powerful abilities, her fourth ability. Deadeye's fourth ability, Ready Steady Fire, plants her into the ground and has her rapidly fire her crossbows in a short arc. You're unable to move for the first second, and the ability lasts for a total of 5, though it can be cancelled after the first. However, with the amount of damage that you can do here, you generally want to make sure that you are at a relatively safe distance before you start firing, otherwise you can get easily overtaken by enemies. The narrow firing arc also means that you should pick the area that you fire from and the angle that you're facing before using the ability with some caution. That said, the ability does a huge amount of damage and is pretty much her best choice for dealing with any high HP enemy that may be coming towards you, specifically bosses or armored enemies. Except for Commander Tower, this is generally going to be able to clear out pretty much anything in front of you with relative ease, and the 2 weavers for it offer some interesting playstyle choices. I'll get to those a little bit later. Either way, this is an extremely solid ability, and it definitely plays into the quirks with Deadeye's playstyle. You want to maintain your range, and as long as you can stay out of harm's way, you'll be able to deal a ton of damage really easily. Deadeye's final abilities are going to be her passive, Infamy, which allows her primary attack to fire small explosions on contact with any surface or enemies. The explosions deal half the damage to the surrounding enemies, though the area of effect is very, very small. The best case scenario for this would be to have enemies packed into about a half unit space so that they take the most damage, but overall you're not going to be hitting like a million enemies by using it. That said, any damage is good damage, and more damage is always a bonus. So it definitely helps with Deadeye being able to control groups with her primary attack a lot better than other characters with slower rates of fire and no AoE attack would be able to do. So that's an important aspect of the character, and actually makes it, again, very good versus soldiers, because you're hitting multiple soldiers, you're firing twice. Overall, it's just really nice. That rhymed and I didn't even intend it. Anyway, in addition to that, we have her 5th ability, her movement skill, which is Out of the Way. This adds a short but noticeable damage buff to her primary attack. It's 20% at base, and it lasts for 5 seconds. So after the roll is initiated, you have a 5-second window of time where you are dealing added damage, and this also applies when Infamy kicks in. So it's sort of important to make sure that you're keeping this buff active when you're in combat. Outside of it, you really don't have to worry about it too much. And the added benefit is that the dodge roll itself has some very small windows of invulnerability and can allow you to absorb attacks or projectiles occasionally. Although I've had some really weird interactions with the way that the Cyclops Mage's homing projectile works, and that could be a case of, the server not realizing that I'm doing the dodge roll or not having it show up at the same time as the client, but I'm not 100% sure on that because I haven't been able to get consistent results with anything that I've tried. Either way, both of these moves are very solid and a core part of Deadeye's kit overall. She's mobile, she deals good damage in areas, and she plays range. So overall, she's just really solid long range damage dealer, and that's pretty much it for her primary kit. So let's get into the weavers, and then we'll talk about what else might be used to make her good. So here we have the initial tier 1 selections for Deadeye's weavers. These come in at battle level 2 as always, and they're actually pretty interesting. We have Spring Loaded, Deadlier Eye, and Hold 'em Back, which all seem pretty nice. Now, Spring Loaded is a attack speed increase. It's pretty straightforward. You fire 15% faster. Deadlier Eye and Hold 'em Back probably need a bit better wording than what they currently have. Deadlier Eye should increase the damage bonus from the hip shot buff, which is gained from Out of the Way, by 50% of whatever its current value is. Now, you'd have to dig to see what that current value is just by looking at the Weaver, but I believe it should be 20% currently. I would like this to just say whatever the base damage bonus is in addition to the buff already, because it would be pretty clear. If you gain an additional 10% on your attacks while hip shot is up, then there you go. But I think that because of the changes here, it always seems better to take the 15% damage bonus. So if they're not going to give you an actual 50% damage buff or more than 15% damage period, then there's no reason to choose that over a permanent 15% attack speed buff, since hip shot doesn't affect anything except for your primary attack. That's probably a balancing issue that'll come out later on, but either way, I think that'll be something that, if changed, would benefit the hero. Then we have the slow for Elven Razorweed. This says the movement slow is increased by 15%. It's unclear if this is 15% total or if this is 15% of whatever its current movement slow is. So I would say this should say something like increases the slow of Elven Razorweed to a flat percentage amount. That way you're aware of whatever its base is, and it is now increased to the amount shown. Now, if you think that there's a better way to word that, feel free to let me know. I like giving any feedback that I receive from here that's good to the devs anyway. So, you know, throw the comment in there and I'll take a look at them whenever I get the chance. Always love reading things from you guys anyway. But those are the first three weavers. I generally go with the attack speed, but the slow from Elven Razorweed, if you're not packing a lot of tar or other heroes that have crowd control abilities, is pretty solid. And again, the hip shot buff, unless it is buffed in some way, is actually going to be a problem. Now, it was bugged at one point to be better, but assuming that gets fixed, it becomes permanently worse than the attack speed buff. Either way, that's enough of going on about those. Let's go ahead and actually move on to the second tier of weavers. Here are Deadeye's second set of weavers. Keeping true to her ability to just deal ridiculous amounts of damage, all three of them affect in some way her ability to deal damage to multiple enemies faster. We have Razorweed Rend, which I will fumble through probably a billion more times in my lifetime, Going Down in Infamy, and Spurred Boots. The Rend is extremely good as it adds a bleed to her Elven Razorweed. Because of the large number of enemies that are normally going to run over it, it effectively allows you to cause a significantly increased amount of damage using the ability. Going Down in Infamy reduces the amount of stacks needed to trigger the Infamy ability. Normally this amount is at 12, this reduces it by a third to 8. That's 8 light enemies or 2 heavy enemies, as light enemies give you 1 point of infamy and heavy enemies give you 4. Spurred Boots allows out of the way to deal damage as you're rolling through enemies. This is sort of tricky in that I don't really see rolling into enemies as being something viable for her, as she doesn't have a ton of HP, but it could be useful for, say, some upcoming challenge if you need additional ways to deal damage without your primary attack. And that has been one of the challenges that they have introduced in the past. So if they were to redo it with a new set of heroes, then that would be something you'd have to pay attention to. Either way, interesting, but my pick for the majority of cases is going to be for the Razorweed Rend, just because of its ease of use and the fact that you can basically set it and forget it. The others require a bit more thought into how they work, except for Going Down in Infamy, but Infamy doesn't really seem to me to be a big enough factor in her overall damage scheme to warrant not picking something like the Rend, which could affect, 20 or 30 enemies at once, rather than just triggering an ability faster. You'll generally lose Infamy between waves, and even with Infamy triggering quicker, there will come a point if you're doing Endless where you just aren't able to trigger it anymore due to you not being able to personally get the killing blow on enemies quick enough. That, and in addition to it, you're really not going to be using your primary attack for the majority of her damage in those situations. So probably not a Weaver that you're going to use often. Maybe it could use a buff or an additional ability on top of it to make it more interesting. Say like increased damage on the actual infamy explosions, or increased area of effect on the infamy explosions, or both. I don't know. Like, that really depends on what would make that Weaver more palatable or tempting to the players. Either way, spurred boots, again, not really that interesting, but I think that's pretty much it for tier 2. Like, there's nothing super crazy here, but I can see where they were going with this, but for now, I'm always on the first Weaver. So let's move on to tier 3. With Deadeye's tier 3 Weavers, we're given our first divergent and really interesting options. The first is Burning Hate, which gives you an explosive damage over time ability which burns enemies. Hard Knocks, which allows Bouncing Bomb to become a stun on impact. And Fistful of Brambles. It adds a Bramble drop similar to her Elven Razorweed to Out of the Way, which allows you to basically use the roll to deal additional damage on top of its damage buff. All of these are actually really solid choices. None of them are bad. But Burning Hate actually seems to be one of the weakest here. And it's one that I would essentially think would be the best overall, but the issue there is that Burning Hate seems to do a much lower percentage of damage than the Bouncing Bomb's base damage, and doesn't really seem to be that strong because of it. However, the amount of extra damage that can be accumulated from Fistful of Brambles is actually really high, because you're able to roll about once every second or two, and you can hit an enemy on multiple brambles. It actually accumulates damage very quickly, especially if you have very narrow pathing for the enemies. So it's deceptively good, but Burning Hate, even with its damage not being super ridiculous, still isn't horrible. It adds a burn damage over time effect, and so may actually help with combos somewhat better, depending on the actual health pool of the enemies. Hard Knocks, on the other hand, is a completely different path to take, as it actually gives you the first and I believe only hard crowd control ability for Deadeye, where you now have a short stun added to the Bouncing Bomb. Because Bouncing Bomb is primarily used against heavy enemies, it could be useful, but lighter enemies will more than likely just get cleared out. I would only see this really being used for either 3-man teams that have very light crowd control options from the other 2 heroes, or if you were trying to solo in Endless. But either way, the options are there, so the diversity in the character builds are definitely present at this particular tier, and I really like the options here. But let's move on to the last area, tier 4. At tier 4, Deadeye has some of the most ridiculously devastating Weaver choices in the game. We have Clear 'em Out, which turns Ready Steady Fire into a barrage of death. We have More Misdeeds, which makes her primary attack a thing of beauty, tripling the damage overall. And then we have Bramble Barricade, which turns Ready Steady Fire into a damage reflection ability of sorts, similar to Max's. All of these on their own are particularly powerful. More Misdeeds has the ability to combo with the earlier Weavers that affect her primary attack and combines well with Infamy. Bramble Barricade gives you a damage reflection ability, so if you happen to play it close when using Ready Steady Fire, you'll be able to deal additional damage with that, and it offers you a bit of protection due to the fact that enemies won't be able to just lay into you repeatedly with their attacks. But Clear 'em Out is probably the most ridiculous Weaver available for Deadeye overall, as with Ready Steady Fire being able to pierce multiple enemies with the right pathing and the right choke points, you can basically use it to clear out almost 100% of the enemies on any given lane at any time. So depending on exactly where you are and your particular playstyle, I could see you choosing any of these, but more often than not, I find myself clicking back and forth between more misdeeds and clear them out, just because of the versatility and ease of use with more misdeeds and the sheer damage output that you're able to get with clear them out. I haven't personally chosen the brambles, but I think that's just because at the level that I'm at, a lot of the damage that I deal is more than enough to clear out most of the regular enemies, and so it would only be something that I want to experiment with in things like weekly challenges. But if that changes, I'll definitely let you guys know, and you'll probably see it in the video. But that should be all of Deadeye's weavers. So that said, her weaver selection is pretty diverse. Everything is basically geared towards damage, other than the slow weaver for her Elven Razorweed and the stun weaver for Bouncing Bomb at tier 3. So for the most part, you're just going to be choosing how to deal more damage, and that's going to come down to how you actually choose to handle the character. Whichever abilities you focus on are going to be the abilities you want to choose weavers for. However, the most powerful aspects of the character are generally going to come down to using her stuns and slows properly and trying to get the most out of Ready Steady Fire, possibly through the use of the Clear 'em Out Weaver, as it is the best way that she has to deal with a large amount of high HP minions. But with the weavers out of the way, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop those below just to make sure that I have everything covered. But we're going to move on to actually looking at traits that are useful for Deadeye, and then we'll be wrapping up the video with a summary. So outfitting Deadeye is going to be an interesting situation because basically the character is single-minded in the fact that she only deals damage for the majority of the time. You're not really going to need additional ways to deal damage because you already have a ton of them. Out of the 5 abilities that Deadeye has, 4 of them deal damage and the other one's a damage buff. So things like Firewall Bracers and Ring of Lightning are never not welcome, but I feel like they don't really offer anything to the character's kit outside of a way to expend mana faster. And because of the range that they play at, Deadeye is already going to require a significant amount of mana. So if you're playing medium range, if you happen to get sort of close to enemies, what you're going to find is you're running out of mana really fast. Rolling repeatedly and also using Bouncing Bomb and the Elven Razorweed often are going to require that you refill your mana very rapidly. This will have to be done through either mana restoration gear or a mana well. That said, if you're playing a little bit further back, you probably won't be dealing as much damage, but it is a bit safer. So taking damage traits is probably going to be super important for Deadeye at almost any time. You can also take general purpose good traits such as discounts or anything that may help your teammates, such as if we're talking about gear, things like the Mage's Picnic. So you have a little bit of room for like some team play elements with Deadeye just because of the fact that she is so powerful in dealing damage, and that makes it actually really nice to pick her when you're playing in groups. Her abilities themselves don't augment the ability of your team, but just about everything else that you can select outside of the actual character can. So that's good, and I like that aspect about picking her. That said, you're not really going to want to use things like Respect My Authority because, as was even put up in the blog post for Deadeye, she has very little crowd control, and what she does have requires you to select 2 of her 4 weavers to make it more impactful. So probably something you're going to want to steer clear of if you can devote an entire character to making that happen otherwise. But if you do need somebody to deal damage, she is going to be an excellent choice in that regard. But that's pretty much Deadeye in a nutshell. She's ranged, she's powerful, she deals a ton of damage, she deals it rapidly in a lot of little pieces, and she is just really heavy micromanaging of her cooldowns and abilities. So if that's your style, if you like being able to deal a ton of damage, if you like pushing a lot of buttons, Deadeye's probably going to be a hero for you. So give her a shot, pick her up, maybe play with her in a few of the weekly challenges. Let me know what you guys think about Deadeye and what you feel about what she can do. Is she the character for you? Do you not like her? Is there some things that you would still like changed about her? For me, she seems really nice in the area that she's in. I'm really not sure how you would change the character to make her more or less useful in other situations without changing really how she seems to be defined in the game at this time. But that's just me. Either way, thanks as always for watching, you guys. I sincerely appreciate it. I apologize for this actually coming really late. There's been a lot of things going on just personally with me, and I'm pretty much working through the end of those now, you know, the holidays and everything coming up. So I should be back to pumping out more videos. After this, we're going to move on to some other things that I wanted to work on, probably push towards Elin and actually get some non-Orcs stuff up soon, just because a couple of things have been thrown at me, and I figure might as well put those up too. Either way, let me know what you think. Feel free to comment. I like reading those, and I like getting back to you guys with whatever you have to say. And until next time, as always, have a good one, folks.